All right. Let's start off with an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship on the lands on which we meet. We pay our respect to their elders, descendants, and future generations. And we continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. I'd just like to point out that these traditional owners, the Turrbal and Yagara people, were the first biodiversity scientists and the first conservationists in this land and have made great contributions to biodiversity and science. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Felipe, who will be talking today about two of his favorite topics, birds and spatial scales. He's did his PhD at UQ, so he's coming back to CBCS to give this talk, and he's an excellent speaker, excellent researcher. So take it away.
Thank you, Matt. Everyone, thank you very much, Matt, for the introduction. It's great to be here again. As Matt said, I did my PhD here a few years ago, and I had the opportunity and the pleasure to work here when this was the Center of Excellence for Environmental Decisions between 2014, I think, and 2018 for me. But it was the center was there for a longer period, so it was a very rewarding experience. I met a lot of nice people, and most of the research that I will show you today come from the ideas that came out from some discussions with people from here and collaboration with people from UQ. So, as Matt said, I'm gonna be talking about birds, urban birds in particular. I don't know much about birds in general, but I really like the birds of Southeast Queensland, so and especially the birds in Brisbane. And my main objective today is to show you that caring about urban biodiversity is also very good, and that you can find a lot of very cool stuff. And yeah, so should I find it? Okay, so this is Brisbane, a very green city. We have it's great that we live in a city that has a lot of green spaces and that are very close to us. It's the home to nearly 400 species of birds that have been recorded. I mean, this includes migratory species. They don't live here all the time. Obviously, we consider all the local government areas, so we are including things like Mankuta and some of the protected areas around here. But you don't need to travel too far to see a lot of a great diversity of birds in this area. And in some of these areas, I mean, if you're keen in just hiking or doing some bird watching, you can see that if you go to the north, to Chinchitala, for example, one area that has more than 200 species recorded, almost 240. Oxley Creek Common, a very central area, not too far from here. They're surrounded by a lot of anthropogenic pressure, 216 species, and then you have other habitats like the sandy camp, road wetlands, more than 200 species. So this gives us an idea of how diverse is Brisbane and the opportunities that we have to interact with nature here, even in areas that could be immersed in a landscape matrix that could be very transformed. But when we talk about species, not only, I'm just talking about like general numbers here, right? Like the number, we just say 216 species, but we know that we have a very different set of species. And this different set of species are related to the traits that they have in terms of how big they are, or the types of bill morphologies, the wingspan, some behavioral traits. So we can also quantify diversity in terms of this diversity of traits. So the title of my talk is related to this ecosystem functioning approach to understand other dimensions of diversity that are important to protect biodiversity in cities. Okay, So coming back to cities, when we zoom out, I started just with the overall patterns of diversity and how diverse is Brisbane. But obviously, when you look at Brisbane and you compare it with Sydney or Melbourne, you look at these cities, the first thing that you will see is that we have a lot of fragmentation in terms of how the remnant green spaces are distributed in the cities. So you have these big areas, yeah, that still manage to harbor a lot of species. And then you have the potential of getting all of these species in here, depending on how connected are those habitats, right? So you have a lot of small patches here, patches that could be connected or not, that are immersed in this very harsh matrix, urban matrix where you have built infrastructure and you have pets, you have noise, you have different anthropogenic impacts that could be affecting the type of species that you find here. And we can look at Brisbane, some of these areas, for example, like the gap here, one of those areas that is very low-key in the sense that it's surrounded by a lot of vegetation, right? And people in their gardens could get a lot of species. But then you get other areas, yeah, here in the south, like for example, this is Tuki Forest, that still manages to get a lot of species, but are surrounded by a lot of these urban matrix, right? So you can quantify species in a city and say like, oh, we have a lot of species, but what we really care about is not only counting how many species you can take if you go to a specific area, right, in this overall region, but how can we maximize that diversity in areas where people are interacting with nature more often, right? So how can we connect all of these patches here that are important for many species? And to understand that, we need to get some concepts related to the ideas of fragmentation, right? So we have these areas here, you can see a lot of small patches. Some of them are connected, some of them are just isolated, right? And that breaking apart of the general habitat in these areas, that's what we consider fragmentation, landscape fragmentation, and that's very important for these areas where you have small amounts of vegetation that are remnant, right? And that could be fragmented, that could be connected or not, right? And fragmentation brings some, if you think about like patches, these two patches here, these two fragments, fragmentation could bring reduction in the overall, in the mean patch size in these areas. So you would expect that if you're measuring the diversity of the species, imagine that you're saying how diverse are the species in terms of their traits. So for example, if you have a big range of species that have different sizes or that have different biomorphology, you would expect that when there is reduction in the patch size, you will reduce the trait value ranges because there is more homogenization in the type of species that you will find, okay? And you can see that there is a lot of evidence, for example, if you think about the tropics, large species, those are the first species that you're losing in those areas where there is a high reduction in the fragment size. But patterns in other areas, like here in Brisbane, are different actually. You get a lot of large species, and what you're missing or you're losing in these areas that are fragmented are those small species, insectivorous. So how can we identify this relationship between the patch size and the actual fragmentation? Because we know that we can get very different contrasting patterns depending on the type of region that you're analyzing, right? And that can happen as well with the increase in edge effects. So you would also expect like some changes in terms of how the species distribution in terms of their traits is changing in areas that have patches that have a lot of edge effects versus areas that have small edge effects, right? So how you have fragment interior or edge tolerant species, so that could be another effect of fragmentation. And you can also have some changes in connectivity, right? So depending on how the patches are connected to some source patches that could have some species that are more vulnerable to fragmentation, you can have some movement from those species to those patches that are well connected, and that will also affect the overall trait diversity in each area. So my plan is not to explain like what are the mechanisms here that will affect if distribution is going this way or that way, but the key message here is that the trait distribution changed. And we know that from theoretical and empirical evidence in some areas, but understanding how these different attributes interact to actually drive these different trait distributions across regions, that's something that is not it's something that gets a lot of mixed evidence at the moment. Okay, so considering that we have different landscapes, giving a bit of theory here before moving into the case studies, but considering that we have a lot of different interactions between the fragments in one area, and you can have different trait distributions, and that could affect how diverse is a community. One of the main things that we are interested, especially in human-dominated landscapes like this one, is like the one in Brisbane, is understanding how we can manage fragmentation to actually improve diversity of species, not only in terms of the number of species, but also in the diversity of these trait values. Okay? So coming back to Brisbane, so we can talk about the concept of landscape structure, right? Which is basically you can have large patches like this one, or you can have a lot of small patches that could be connected or spread out across the entire city. So how different land cover types of habitats are distributed in this space, that's what we consider the landscape structure, and that will give us an idea of potential effects of fragmentation and the habitat and the remnant habitat on species diversity. So we know that landscape structure matters based on the previous conceptual evidence that I presented, that framework. But how can we use that to actually think about preserving species in these human-dominated landscapes? So this is part of some work that was done by some researchers from the University of Queensland. Most of them are actually in other places now, except Martin's still here, but the main thing about Brisbane is that when you look at the vegetation structure in terms of how diverse is the vegetation in terms of the vertical structure, if you have a lot of understory or you have a lot of canopy, and the diversity of that, is that when you have more vegetation in one area, in Brisbane you tend to have more correlation with vegetation structure. So when you reduce the extent of vegetation and you increase fragmentation, in Brisbane the urban vegetation tends to be simplified in terms of the vertical structure, right? So considering this relationship for Brisbane, we analyze how landscape structure can affect urban diversity by looking at the relationship between the average amount of tree cover in one area, assuming that that's also a proxy to understand the vertical structure of the vegetation here, comparing different landscape configurations. Yeah, so how that could affect if you have a landscape where you have similar amounts of vegetation, but in different levels of fragmentation, what would be the effects on the overall distribution of bird traits in cities? So we analyzed that for different groups of birds in Brisbane, and considering that relationship between built infrastructure, which is one of the characteristics of landscape structure in Brisbane, right? Like how much areas of buildings or impervious surface you have, also how much tree cover you have, and also the level of fragmentation, how that could affect both species richness, the amount of the species that you have in one area, but also the distribution of these traits, right? And here we're talking of functional divergency, and this is a very simplified way to say it, that it's just how different are the species in the community that you're looking. Not only how many species you have, but how different they are. So when you look at these relationships here, for example, for this group of insectivorous versus frugivorous nectarivorous, you will always see that obviously the more built infrastructure you have in one area and there is reduction in habitat, very negative effects on species richness. You will always have a decline in the number of species that you can find. But when you look at the relationship between built infrastructure, depending on how fragmented and the amount of tree cover, you can actually get very small number of species, but that could be very different. Yeah. So this gives us an idea of, okay, there is a potential, maybe, to understand how we can basically manage green spaces in some areas, right? To maintain the species that are different in their traits, not only very diverse communities in terms of species richness or species abundances, but also in terms of how different are those species. So this very this relationship here with built infrastructure is not that strong with functional divergency. It's basically telling us, oh, there is some potential. There are other factors that could be affecting how different are the species in one area, even if species richness is declining. Okay, so the key message here is that when you have one type of vegetation structure in the city, like at the landscape scale, you just preserve some areas that have these large patches that are not well connected, you tend to get medium to large size and high dispersal species, right? There is more competition. These species tend to colonize these areas and exclude all the species that are small. Okay? The same thing happens when you increase fragmentation a lot, right? You get a lot of species that get to these edges, exclude the species that can find these small habitats, and you will get a very similar type of assemblage with the species that tend to be also medium large and high dispersal. But when you think about these species, these configurations where you actually have patches that are relatively large, that are well connected, and that are mixed, interspersed with a matrix that is not that harsh, thanks to these small patches that are spread out across the entire city, that's when you actually start getting species that are relatively diverse in terms of their traits. So in urban communities, what we really need to aim for is to have a mix of these different strategies. So that debate of if you should have just large patches or the small patches, actually small patches that are well connected tend to have higher diversity if the habitat is good enough for these species, rather than having these large patches in these areas. Because some of the problems that we have in areas like Griffith is that some species like the noisy miners are very good colonizing many of these areas, right? And excluding the species that are that can compete very well, even if you have enough habitat in terms of vegetation structure. Okay, so this is why you get a lot of species in areas like Oxley Creek, that you would think is an area that don't have a lot of amount of vegetation, but there is a good heterogeneity in habitat, but also it's a very well connected area. There are other areas that have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of vegetation, but are not there that well connected, and the amount of the species that you get is much lower. Okay? In terms of their traits and in terms of the species richness. So when you look at those relationships, just in terms of how different are the species here, so look at this community, just looking at the overall body size, compare areas that are low fragmented versus high fragmented. In areas that are relatively high fragmented, that's when you get more species that are big here, right? Versus these ones that are low fragmented, where you get more species that are small here. So when you compare that at the landscape scale, we can see clearly those differences in terms of the fragmentation, because fragmentation is a landscape scale process, right? But when you analyze that at side scales, that's when you start missing some of these relationships, right? So this is the landscape scale, the one that I just showed you. And this is just when we look at 1 hectare, a local scale, and compare different sampling points, how different are the areas that are classified as fragmented versus not fragmented. And the implications of this is that you can have a lot of local scale management in some areas, right? But if you don't consider what is happening at the landscape scale, you might be having areas where you are planting a lot of vegetation, you are getting new habitats that are heterogeneous, but if these areas are immersed in a landscape that is not well connected, what you are doing actually in cities is incentivize the homogenization of communities with species that are well adapted to urban environments. So you can find more information about that in this paper here. And the key message here is that local management actions that don't consider landscape structure effects may favor species that are already more adaptable to these urban landscapes. Okay. And that's one of the main issues that we have in cities, right? Like how we can plan actually to manage landscapes, because most of the work that is done is at very local scales in terms of restoration groups that go to a creek and plant vegetation, or the vegetation that you plant in some of these gardens, right? To incentivize new habitats for species. So those things are important, but if you don't consider how well connected are those areas, this might not work in terms of favoring local communities. So I've been talking just about how you can protect diversity of birds in these areas, but there is another thing that we are also aware, and it's the importance of preserving those services that we get from nature, right? Especially in these human-dominated environments where access to natural areas is not as common for many people. And this is, I don't know if you remember, but this here is one of the visions that the Australian government, like the local council, had for Victoria Park. Like, this is like from 2021, I think. We even sent like a policy brief to this saying, oh yeah, how you should have a vision of improving biodiversity in this area, and how it would be connected to different sites so you can improve bird diversity. Well, and there was a lot of consultation with communities and a lot of work in terms of how they can plan these things so they can improve ecosystem services, recreation, cultural activities, but also the protection of biodiversity. And you know what happened now with Victoria Park, right? Like they are just going to build a stadium there without considering any of this. And actually, if you've read the news recently, you've seen that most of the regulations in terms of environmental impact assessments have been scrapped for all the projects that are related to the Olympics. So they don't need to even consider what would happen with cultural significant sites or with biodiversity in these areas, right? I just wanted to point out that because I mean that's one of the main challenges as well. Having all this information, providing the information to local councils, and then thinking, oh, this would be something that could be used in the future. At that point, it looked like something that they were actually considering at the local council, and then look what happens very quickly. Things can change. So I think it's very important. I think this information, if someone is already thinking how's the translation between this and actually policy in the city, I think it's more about working with local groups to get more, to get just more track in terms of improving biodiversity by working with local communities. And of course, we need to work with councils, but things can change very, very quickly. So green spaces are very important. We know that we have, just when you walk through a forest, even if you can still listen some cars and things, if you're in the city and you see vegetation, there is a lot of evidence showing that you can get some benefits in terms of improving health and well-being, right? And there's a lot of research on that. But just related to, before moving into the specifics of the benefits, you know that green spaces are also, because they are fragmented in these areas, the way that you can get the benefits from all these spaces, like in terms of, in terms of getting the carbon sequestration or these interactions between the people and nature in these areas. That will depend on how is the distribution of those green spaces, right? How is the accessibility to those areas for people as well? So we already know, I showed you that depending on how fragmented is the habitat, that could affect the type of species that you will get, right? But that could also affect how people interact with these areas to actually get some benefits from here, right? So you can actually increase interspersion for the green spaces in one area and then increase the opportunities for recreation, right? Or to walk around those areas and interact with nature easily, right? So in this case, it's better to have like small patches of vegetation that are spread out across the entire city rather than having just a single patch, right? Where not everyone would access to those benefits. So considering this theory that fragmentation also affects the potential of people to interact with these areas, we can start thinking about specific cultural services that we get from cities as well. And I'm sure many of you like bird watching, not everyone here, but a lot of people will like it, right? Even if you don't like bird watching and you're not like a crazy twitcher and just I have to find this species, just listening to birds is something that we enjoy, right? Or just saying, oh, this is a fairy wren here, that it's something that is not that uncommon in Brisbane, but you wouldn't see it everywhere, right? So just seeing birds like that has been shown in different areas that can improve mental health and foster this sense of well-being as well, right? So another question would be, okay, if I show you this species here, right? For sure they will bring you like some different feelings, right? Like if I ask you, oh, which of these species would you like to see the most, or which of these species brings you some joy, right? It would be relatively easy for you to divide that, right? Like, yeah, I really like these ones here. Is that, yeah, compared to these ones. For some people, it could be the experience, and they would say, oh, noisy miners, they are great, like how they work in groups and they are super smart, and I really like when they are opening the sugar and all these things here. I really like them, they are badass, right? You can think about that. But in general, there are some traits that actually make people think that species are more attractive than others, right? So we know that there is some experience related with this, but when you don't know the species and when you don't interact with the species that much, we know that there are traits that drive this aesthetic attraction to birds, okay? So the color, the way that they call, the behavioral characteristics, and there is a lot of research as well, or some recent research, actually, there is not as much, but just showing how depending on the type of coloration or the shape of the birds, people will find them more attractive, yeah? And this has other implications in terms of how people think about protecting biodiversity, right? And how close they feel to nature. So there is some research done in Australia where of how are we choosing potentially species that could increase this connection between nature and people. And this is a study led by Stephen Garnett, just showing which would be the different type of traits that you can find for different species and how people consider some of these species without considering the experience, just by controlling that. In terms of what are those species that you would consider more attractive, right? And this is a categorization, a broad categorization in terms of color, in behavioral characteristics, and also in terms of how they call as well. Yeah, how melodious is the call, or how quiet are these species, right? So these are traits. So I was showing you just traits related with the ecological large body mass, or just the wingspan, or the dispersal capacity. We can actually quantify the diversity of these traits in cities as well, right? So we did that for Brisbane using the same set, the same data set. And we calculated an attractiveness score in terms of all the local communities that we were finding in these transformed areas. And we found that fragmentation and built infrastructure were actually having a negative impact in terms of what are these species that people like, the potential of these species that could be considered more attractive in terms of this objective kind of data set of how you, well, it's objective in terms of this is based on a choose experiment. I mean, they did everything just to try to control for everything here to get what would be the more attractive or less attractive. But this is just the first step to look at what are the species that could be considered more attractive, and if we are just quantifying that at the assemblage level, are we losing those species that have that potential to increase these interactions between people and nature in cities? So we found, for example, that vegetation structure is very important to keep these species that are melodious in cities, right? Like some of these species. It has an impact also in colorful species as well. So just this one here, I'll come back to this in a minute. But it also has some impacts in terms of the potential of having the species with different color or pattern in cities. But and we got the same results even when we control for these very abundant species like lorikeets that you could consider like very colorful as well, or some pied butcher birds that are very melodious, right? But just controlling for those species as well, we got the same similar patterns. And you can see here the importance of considering that relationship between size, right? Here, and built infrastructure. When you're getting more species that are big here, that are harsh here, that are harsh in terms of these calls. Yeah, so how built infrastructure and size are interacting, so you get more of these species that are harsh. And also here, you will get more species that tend to be larger, yeah, and that will have these pattern colors, right? It's like magpies or butcher birds or lorikeets as well. So urban built infrastructure can negatively affect the species richness and homogenize those species traits. But these built areas can exhibit high overall bird attractiveness in areas where we reduce fragmentation and where we increase the diversity of vegetation structure that provides key habitats for these many colorful and melodious species. Okay. So just to finalize, there is a lot of research that has been done across Australia and in other parts of the world, just showing how we can design cities and these spaces that will manage biodiversity and increase overall diversity. So you can see all these small streetscapes that are very good for increasing other groups' diversity, not necessarily birds, but that have been applied with this concept of urban biodiversity sensitive design. But the main thing, and this is something that people are starting doing more, is considering landscapes, but in terms of the management and the application is still, we are with a lot of challenges or actually planning at the scales that we need to maintain urban biodiversity. So there are these cool models that are showing, okay, not only, I mean, I presented some of this evidence from the functional diversity perspective, but you can also see how different groups of species will get more benefits when you actually consider landscapes and connectivity in cities. And for some areas like this, like the Gap, very good. You have a lot of landscape, doing like a lot of replanting, gardens here with this diversity vegetation structure. It's very good in terms of all those local site management actions are very good to improve biodiversity. For areas like this, Victoria Park, if we are thinking that just by planting some vegetation around that would be enough without considering connectivity of this area, we are actually putting a lot of risk in terms of the bird communities that we have there. And all these resources that could be spent in restoration projects at local scales could be lost if we actually don't plan for a larger scale and we don't protect these areas. So some of the implications of this is that, as I'm saying, lack of effectiveness of these conservation and management actions that ignore landscape. There is more and more evidence, not only here in Brisbane, but in other areas, that is showing this. The importance of considering these different metrics, dimensions of biodiversity, to actually look at the entire picture of how we can protect biodiversity. Trade-based approaches can help to track these initiatives of how communities are changing, but also there is this big potential of starting looking at how we can understand those traits that may improve human-nature interactions, and also how we can look at all of these examples to understand how urban landscapes might be structured to increase this people connection with nature and the potential of improving these cultural services in cities. So this is a work that, it started with my PhD. I've been working on that through different collaborations here with the University of Queensland, of course, but also we have some collaborations and ongoing projects that started thanks to the German government, University of Australia, some work that from this comes from support from the Colombian government and the Australian government, and I just put here some of the key collaborators of this project, and you can see that most of them are from here, from UQ. So I'm very keen to keep talking about this. We are planning to redo the surveys for what I did in the PhD 8 years ago. So we are going to survey birds in Brisbane in July, August again, if anyone is keen to come and just see how the landscape has changed, how the urban communities have changed. And if you know a student that is keen to come more often as well, being part of this project. So yeah, just here's my email, please contact me, reach out, and yeah, to answer any questions. Thank you.
Felipe, really interesting. Lots of questions, but the most important one was at the end there, which is that, so you're saying that Victoria Park is a good place for a stadium.
I'm saying that that when we look at this policy brief like 4 years ago, we actually identified a lot of areas that were well connected that could improve biodiversity in the area. If you actually manage the vegetation inside this section here of the park. Like if the vision that they were thinking about increasing green spaces for people, like for just hikes and people having some interaction with those remnant vegetation, that was very good in terms of improving some of the I think it's, what is the creek that is north there? Bulimba, I think, is the creek that is north of Victoria Park. Well, Enogra Creek, I think. Yeah, so Enogra Creek, that was a very good corridor for improving biodiversity at some point. I think just setting up a big stadium there is, you will still have green spaces, of course, they will keep that as a park, but you will get the same type of space that you get anywhere in Brisbane, right? Like, you won't have the opportunity, for example, to get these cool species. I don't know if you heard it. If anyone here follows something about birds in Brisbane, you know that noisy beetle was found last week or 2 weeks ago, just near Sherwood Arboretum, and it was actually recorded in one of the gardens in Yeronga, right? So those species that you would think, oh, I will only find it in a forest, those kind of species won't be able to use this kind of habitats. So the Sherwood Arboretum is actually a very good example of how they are considering revegetation in the area. They've been doing it for a long time, but it's also in an area that has this opportunity to be well connected towards the south and towards the north to Oxley Creek and all those areas. So it's possible doing these management actions that consider these connections could actually improve biodiversity. But I think the examples of what is happening in terms of development are more going towards the negative side rather than the victories in cities.
This is super interesting, Felipe. Is Australia weird without noisy miners being so dominant? Because there must be a strong interaction by just density of vegetation. Like you can have an open park that's got lots of trees in it, or you can have a bush in the middle of a roundabout that's really thick. And I'm just blown away in Ipswich, which is close to where I live now. There'll be a bush in the middle of a roundabout and there's no trees, 360 degrees, and yet the fairy wrens in that bush in the middle of the roundabout are just going crazy. And so, yeah, it's like the density of the vegetation really interacting with the fragmentation, etc.
So the density of the understory is very important. It's not, you can get some places that have a lot of trees, but you don't have enough understory. That's the fairy wrens are very good to like colonize those areas, but they are not so good. I mean, I don't know if this roundabout how good connected would be. You have to look at the landscape scale, but usually if you don't have good vegetation, like what we found is that at least if you at the 1 kilometer scale you don't have enough vegetation that will be sourcing those species, you won't get them. And actually, fairy wrens are declining. Those species you can still see them a lot, like the redbacks and superbs, but those species are declining in many areas just because they are very good at colonizing this understory if you have a lot of density. But if you don't have enough productivity around, they start like disappearing. So yeah, I think there is a relationship between fragmentation and vertical structure, but the reality for Brisbane is that more fragmented are the habitats, the less vertical structure you get. So in general, you tend to lose more species.
This is all absolutely fascinating. Thank you for bringing this topic to us. I'm a little curious though if you can define maybe a little bit more concretely what you mean when you say things like connectivity, because when I look at a map like this, I can't help but wonder, would improving vegetation simply along roadways and stuff be enough to bring in that connectivity you described, because this is already so built up? Or at a certain point, do we have to start talking about opening space a little more? Like, how significant does a corridor have to be for it to start addressing this fragmentation that you described?
So the connectivity will be really, connectivity, I'm talking about the potential of one species to move from one random patch to another. That's like a very general. I would say that there are two main components of that. One is, and this is actually something that we're analyzing with some of the collaborations with the people in Germany, that it's not only the patch, how well connected is to other patches in terms of distance, but the type of matrix that you have. So it's not only about preserving like these areas here in terms of, okay, let's put a corridor here that will connect to another area. Because usually when you have a very harsh matrix, those corridors don't work as well. Yeah. So it's also about managing the landscape in terms of the matrix, and that's why I was showing this part here, that when you actually have this combination of these dark patches with areas that make the matrix a bit more hospitable, yeah, that's when you get gains for biodiversity in these human-dominated landscapes. But if you only are thinking about these areas that are immersed in a very harsh matrix, that's when you tend to lose more species, and things like these changes in the balances and the dominance of these very aggressive species tend to happen.
Research question to quantify, doesn't it?
It's something I've wondered for context. I'm from the Los Angeles area, California, and it's very much the same maps you're showing, minus all of the lovely vegetation in the neighborhoods. It's just what you have on this slide, which is just the top patch. So you have nice parts and just cement.
Yeah.
So it's something I've wondered a long time, is in an area that's already built, how much you would have to replace to soften the matrix, as opposed to more redesigning around the existing landscape.
I mean, improving like corridors of vegetation along creeks and gardens would be good, but that would also kill until certain scale, right? If the patch that you're talking about is like, there's nothing around in 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers, it's very difficult to actually get some gains biodiversity. In overall, like in Brisbane, we have areas that are well connected, so that's why we have a lot of biodiversity, right? But I'm thinking more about how to improve biodiversity at these scales of 1-2 kilometers where people are interacting with nature.
Excellent talk. I'm wondering, governments that are now sort of under pressure to build a lot more housing. If this research can sort of inform where to put it, because we talked about sort of already, like, how do you soften the matrix, but what about just like not making it more harsh? Is there recommendations that you would give to the government around, like, would you say place dense housing near train stations and try and keep these outer suburbs as soft as possible, or would you say there's some other things?
I'd say that depends on the area of the city that you are, but if we're talking about the areas around the CBD, yeah, areas like here around St. Lucia or Fairfield or those areas, I would say that I think high density is the best way to go. But there is something that I didn't discuss here, and it's not actually analyzed in these areas. It's like how this 3-dimensional connectivity could change for species. It's not only about having like a good metrics like when we are walking, but also how these big buildings could have an impact of all these species that are moving around. So high density is important, but I would be against like having very, very tall buildings in some of these areas that work as corridors to connect different areas of the city.
Just compliments online, no question.